Welcome to your online lecture for Chapter 2. In this online lecture, we'll be looking at the various methods of biblical study. I might be referring to them as well as the different criticisms or methods of analyses, or even the different lenses through which we read the Bible. These methods help us to interpret the Bible, to understand, to study the Bible in different ways. And throughout the course, I invite you to develop each of those different methodologies as we look at Scripture from the Old Testament to the New Testament. The methods of biblical study could be divided into three main categories. Each of the methods will be defined a little bit later. The first area is the intrinsic methods. These help us to understand the meanings of the literature itself. So it's like, studying an English literature, looking at the forms, looking at how the author uses language to express and to bring out a theme. The second grouping is the extrinsic methods, and these help us to understand what the Bible meant when it was written. So this looks, externally to all of the different elements, contexts from which the Bible was written. And then finally, the contemporary methods. These help contemporary readers today understand what the Bible means. Now, each and every one of us comes with particular perspective on the Bible, whether it's a faith one or a non-faith one, and within each faith tradition as well, there's different approaches to the Bible. But these contemporary methods also include those, but particularly some of the methodologies which exist in biblical scholarship today. Let's look now at the three categories of methodologies of studying the Bible. The first is the intrinsic methods, and the goal of this approach is to understand the meanings of the literature itself. One method within this is formal criticism. The formal critic places heavy emphasis on style, form, or technique in the literature, and even structure. Some formal critics will see these elements as more important than even the content itself. One way to understand the motivation of this method is when we think about the Bible as a library. A formal critic very much sees the Bible as a collection of different genres. And so the formal critic says, first and foremost, what genre are we picking up here in the library that is the Bible? And that will influence how we interpret it. Because as you know, if we go to the library, we're not going to read Shakespeare in the same way that we read a newspaper, and so on. And so how we understand the genre really does affect how we understand the Bible in itself. Another method of intrinsic study is rhetorical criticism. The rhetorical critic looks at the writer's use of literary technique common to all literature. For example, key words, themes, and motifs that the writer may use, and literary devices such as metaphors, hyperbole, and irony. So by now, you would have studied some literature and noted that each and every writer, each and every poet has their own particular style. The rhetorical critic looks at that particular writer's style and how that influences the storytelling, how they develop the theme, and so on. Your textbook authors provide some helpful steps to examine the literary world of the Bible. The first step is by establishing the boundaries of the text. And this is common to all biblical study. So the question at hand is, what exactly are we looking at specifically? Are we looking at an entire book of the Bible? Are we looking at one chapter or one literary unit? And so on. So that's the first step in looking at the literary world. The second is distinguishing between the different types of literature that we encounter. We just talked about form criticism, and so this is certainly an area in which the form critic is quite concerned about. In your textbook, in tables 2.1 and 2.2, you'll see a listing of all the different genres that one might encounter when reading the Bible. And related to this distinguishing the type of literature is observing the language. Is it more poetry or more prose? And what are the characteristics of poetry and of prose? When we ask these questions, it helps us to understand how we ought to interpret it as well. The next step to examine the literary world of the Bible is searching for themes. As you know, themes are organizing motifs that dominate a literary unit. For example, the principal theme in the Song of Songs is the paradox of love in the world. Certainly when we study Scripture, looking for themes is the most interesting thing, perhaps, for us, rather than looking at the structure and even the language being used. The theme is really where we derive the message from. The next step is identifying the structures. There are typical structures, patterns that are shared by literature of a certain type, and there are unique structures, patterns that are unique to the text itself. And we'll see both. We'll see typical structures that occur in the Old Testament and we find later on in the New Testament, and even in contemporary literature, we can determine what a haiku or a sonnet is based on its structure. And the same thing when we look at the Bible. There are certain norms and conventions in terms of structure that are being used by the different authors. And next, we then present an integrated reading. We use all of our different literary methods, and then we create a coherent observation based on all of those different studies and applications of methodologies. And so a question here is, what can I say about this literature, knowing the theme, knowing the structure, knowing the hand of the author, and so on? By doing this, it helps us to derive a meaning and a message for today. And now we shift to the second category of biblical methodologies, the extrinsic study. And within this, there are two types. The first, literary history, looks at the development of the literature itself, and it has many criticisms, which will be defined a little bit later. The second type of extrinsic study looks to the Bible as a source for history itself. Methods include the following listed there, and again, these will be defined in future slides. And first up within the literary historical methods is traditions criticism, which seeks to reconstruct the development of individual elements within texts to find their point of origin and to trace how they have been adapted as they have been transmitted. For example, Paul passing on the tradition in his writings and preaching the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, the question asks, how does Paul use the historical event that is the resurrection of Jesus in his writing to communities? Another example is the exile of Israel. There we can ask, how do different writers approach, speak about, and develop the theme of the exile within their writings? Source criticism is the type of analysis that seeks to identify the various written sources used in the writing of the Bible as part of the effort to reconstruct the history of the literature. For example, the gospel writers used common sources in developing their gospels. We can think about a river and its tributaries as a good analogy for sources and the work itself. So if we think of a river as being one gospel, the Gospel of Mark, for example, Mark will have drawn from small little tributaries and sources which all together constitute the Gospel of Mark. We see this as well in the Pentateuch, that is the first 5 books of the Bible. There, in each of the different books, we see different sources being drawn from to create an overarching narrative. Redaction criticism addresses this final stage in which the text is edited. The redaction critic looks for evidence of the work of an editor who has combined sources together to create a text or added material to an existing text. An analogy here is a university instructor reading through student papers. The university instructor will read a paper knowing that the student will draw from different sources and cite and so on, but they will also be able to detect where the hand of the actual writer is in the paper. The redaction critic does the same. He or she will look at a scripture book and say, where is the writer's hand in this, as opposed to where are the sources in that writing. Textual criticism is a methodology which examines the transmission of works once they have been written and seeks to reconstruct the most likely original texts. This method won't be looked at so much in this course, but if you choose to do further studies in New Testament or Old Testament studies and even grad studies, this is something that's quite central to your biblical studies. Canonical criticism examines works in terms of their place in the collections deemed authoritative in the Jewish and Christian communities. For example, a canonical critic might pick up a Christian Bible and notice how and where certain books are placed. For example, the prophets are placed in a Christian Bible in the Old Testament towards the end of the Old Testament, because the prophets lead towards Jesus, which you find in the first books of the New Testament, the Gospels. And so the canonical critic says, notice that placement of the books in the and stories in the Bible. And those canonical critics would also ask, why are those books placed where they are? This leads us to our first question for discussion, namely, what is the value of looking at the Bible, the development of the Bible, using these methodologies? Why bother using traditions criticism or form criticism and so on? When you respond to the questions on the Word document that you can download on eClass, it would be really helpful if you could also define the method itself, and then to explain why it's important or why bother using that methodology. Let's shift now to the second category of extrinsic study, the Bible as a source for history. The empirical historical method is a method that uses observable evidence to answer what actually happened. So, for example, when we read the conquest narratives in Joshua, a historical critic would say, did it actually happen? And if so, what actually happened? Do we have evidence for this? The empirical historical method suggests a hypothesis, examines the evidence, including documents and archaeological data, and then finally makes a judgment. Historical anthropology is a field of study that uses a variety of models of human behavior valid in different cultures. These models, which come from sociology, social psychology, and anthropology, help us to understand biblical history too. In the course, we'll certainly be able to apply this in some really strong situations and scenario. And you might find these methods to be quite helpful in your own interpretation of the Bible. Biblical archaeology is the study of human cultures in the biblical world through the disciplined investigation of their material remains. Biblical archaeology has revolutionized biblical studies over the past century. It's revealed cultures, Israel's neighbors, including their literature and how people lived. One way of understanding biblical archaeology is like rifling through a grandparent's old trunk and seeing what they have in there. It kind of gives us a picture of our grandparents when we do that. Here we have an example of archaeological strata. This is no different than what a biblical archaeologist might find in the Holy Land doing a dig. Notice the different layers built up over time. A biblical archaeologist would study remains and look at artifacts and ask, what do we find there? What can we say about the culture of the time? So, for example, a biblical archaeologist looking at ancient ruins from the Greek period might ask, how much influence is there amongst Greek society within Jewish society based on what we find in Jewish homes of the period? And now we turn to the third category of biblical study, that is the contemporary methods. Each of these we'll look at in the following slides, briefly. But in your textbook you certainly have a little bit more in terms of how they're defined. Reader response criticism argues that the meaning of a text is not a given. It does not reside in the text itself or its historical context, but in the unique interaction between the particular reader in a particular situation with the text. Readers are often required to fill in the gaps in a text to interpret not only what is present, but also what is missing. This places a certain degree of emphasis on the actual analysis of the reader himself or herself. The reader response critic is concerned primarily about the reader and that interaction between how the reader interacts, interprets, interfaces with the scripture itself. The reader response critic might ask, what is it in the person reading it that would have that person interpret the Bible a certain way? The deconstruction methodology emphasizes the ambiguity in both texts and the interpretation of the text. Deconstruction critics argue that readers actually create their own texts in their encounters with literature. And so we can see this method taking the reader response critical method a further step. A third source now has to be analyzed, namely the construction in the mind of the reader himself or herself. The deconstruction critic would look at that reconstruction in the mind of the reader. Liberation criticism interprets Bible texts from the context of one or more oppressed groups in the world today. For liberation critics, interpretations of the Bible must lead us to God's work of liberating the poor from oppression. In other words, the liberation critic would read the Bible and interpret it looking for the freeing message for oppressed groups today. Feminist criticism shares the conviction that the Bible itself and all interpretations of the Bible have reflected the ideology of male dominance. So feminist critics try to find alternatives that support the dignity and equality of women, children, and racial minorities. The biblical scholar Caroline Oziak outlines 5 contemporary perspectives within the feminist criticisms of the Bible, namely rejectionism, loyalist, revisionist, sublimationist, and liberationist. The further slides will not have definitions of it, but I encourage you to familiarize yourselves with the definitions of them in your textbook. The remaining contemporary methods for studying the Bible are listed there. The theological approach looks at the Bible as a source to derive authoritative religious teachings. This is the approach that religious communities would take today if it's trying to sort out and try to figure out what the Bible is trying to say about certain things of contemporary society, whether it be same-sex marriage, for example, or women's ordination. The devotional approach uses the biblical text for individual or communal devotion, in other words, religious experience or devotional study. This is the approach that religious communities use when doing a Torah or a Bible study. The liturgical use refers to the application of biblical texts in song, chant, or recitation within communal worship. This, however, excludes the sermon or homily of the priest, minister, or pastor in your religious community. And finally, the political use. This is the appeal to Scripture by interpreters to support a particular action by, for, or against governing authority. A strong example of this could be seen in the Great Divide in 17th century, 18th century American history, where Christians used the Bible to support or argue against slavery. Either side would appeal to the Bible for justification for institutionalized slavery or a rejection of it. Here are your questions for reflection, discussion for Chapter 3. I will pull out some of those for our online discussion forum, but I invite you to also respond to them on the Word document and to email them for feedback if you wish. Once again, at the end of the semester, I'll be collecting all of those responses as you'll be giving yourself a self-evaluation on them.